All right. So this session is going to be super interesting and cool. It's on silicon security. We've been talking about it for the past 2 days now, but this is going to be much cooler because we have experienced panelists who come from various industry backgrounds. Axel Poschmann, who's the head of Senate Labs, Rob Wood, who's the head of hardware team at NCC Group, and Matthew Areno, who's part of the Intel hardware security team. Today, most of them will talk on various topics when it comes to hardware security, some stuff related to open source hardware, RISC-V, and how silicon vendors, what silicon vendors are doing to address technical vulnerabilities that inherit in the vendor provided IPs. So I will let the panelists introduce themselves. Rob is going to be the moderator, and so we can start. Can I have the panelist on Spotlight? I hope my panelists didn't go to the breakout room. Okay, here they are. Okay. All right, I see Axel. Hello. Hi, Rob. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, everybody.
Howdy.
Rob, you can start. I think you're on mute still, Rob.
How's that? Is that better?
There we go.
Every time I switch back and forth to the breakout room, it switches the wrong microphone. Okay, well, I guess this is the last session of the day, so welcome everybody for sticking around this late. For some of you, I know there was at least one person overseas late at night. And obviously, we're all here because we have a shared interest in hardware security. And of course, all of our modern hardware has some silicon devices inside, which runs all the software and firmware that we rely on for our features. And so we've basically just assembled a small panel here to have an informal discussion on some of the issues that we see, largely from the design side. And so, of course, as hardware becomes more feature rich and complicated, firmware is often used to tame that complexity. So we have complex state machines and protocols that are like USB and Thunderbolt, PCI Express, et cetera. These are often barely feasible without having some sort of firmware under the covers, and that firmware is often invisible to the user. It's not running on the host CPU; it's running on some embedded CPUs deep in the chipsets. And so with me here, I have Matt Areno. He's currently at Intel. He's working in a hardware security role at a number of employers, and Axel Poschmann, who's currently with Zenith Labs. He's worked previously at NXP and some academia posts in his previous life. And I'll just let them introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Axel?
Hi, thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody, for listening in and for inviting me to the panel. I did my PhD in lightweight crypto with Christoph Hahn in Bochum, Germany. That was in 2009. Then I did some postdoc and assistant professor academic research, mostly on lightweight crypto, side-channel countermeasures in Singapore for 5 years. And then I started NXP in 2014, I guess, back in Hamburg, Germany, as head of vulnerability analysis, which is the side-channel fault injection invasive hardware attack internal red team, if you want, for NXP high security products. And in 2017, I moved over to Abu Dhabi in the UAE and started at Zenith Labs, which is a test and validation lab. And now I'm heading the lab since April. And that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Matt?
Sure. So I'm Matthew Areno. I did my PhD at the University of New Mexico under Jim Plusquelic, focusing at that time on PUF solutions and how to use PUFs inside of crypto engines and for enhancing security on embedded systems. I started my career at Sandia National Labs, worked there for 6 years, and then eventually moved over to Raytheon. At both places was primarily doing offensive security research, doing red teaming type of efforts, ripping things apart, seeing how they could be manipulated, and then eventually got brought over to the defensive side of the house. I figured who better to build the defenses than the person who's spending all their time breaking it. And then in 2019, came over to Intel, I'm now the lead of the security assurance and cryptography group within Intel, and grateful to be here in this conference and thrilled to have the opportunity to chat.
Thanks. And I'm Rob Wood. I didn't introduce myself, I realized. I work at NCC Group. I've been consulting here for 6 years. I run our hardware and embedded systems practice. In previous lives, I had a long history of embedded systems development, mostly in the smartphone space through BlackBerry and Motorola, a few others. But what we do now is we consult. We help a lot of companies who are designing and building the technology that we rely on every day with their security aspects. We work with a lot of chipset vendors and semiconductor manufacturers, and so we see a lot of trends across the industry. And so that's why Trish asked me to help with this particular session. So the first topic I want to cover here is about open hardware. In the last 20 years or so, it seems, at least to me, that our computing platforms have gotten ever more closed. The ROM, microcode, and firmware is distributed binary only. It's often encrypted. It's definitely signed. It basically makes it difficult for the clever users to go in and modify their systems and add features. Innovation often starts by modifying existing platforms and solutions. So and of course, there's always considerable effort by the community to reverse engineer those and learn whatever we can to figure out how those work and extend them. But that's not easy. And of course, some of the other folks here who've spoken earlier today can attest to the level of effort that they've gone through to kind of get that information out of there. So, and at least some industries, notably in the server space, we're seeing emerging requirements for ownership transfer. So, and here I mean like cryptographic ownership. So the ability to re-provision the signing keys to allow users to take ownership of those platforms, which would effectively allow them to be open. We're seeing across many vendors, we're seeing a big adoption of RISC-V, which even at the lower hardware architectures gives us a much lower barrier to entry for things like advanced security protections and other novel concepts. And so I guess the question here is, can you share some thoughts on the future of open hardware and firmware? Because we do see trends in both directions. For no reason, let's start with Axel.
All right, yeah. I think probably Matt is much more suitable to comment on this. But my personal view, and I'd like to make a quick disclaimer, all my views that I express here today is just my personal view, nothing to do with my employer. Fine print over.
Same here.
And I think I fully agree. I really like open source hardware. I used to be an academic. I was always for open sourcing everything. And as you mentioned, I think innovation starts when more people have access to it, more people have a look at it. So, and as you mentioned, also lower cost of entry, I think will allow for a lot of innovation. And because new players will enter the established field. And I think it will be fascinating to see all the innovation that comes here. I think there is a small caveat, and that's about in transparency and full transparency and so on. I think in transparency, so I wouldn't call it even security by obscurity, but it might be have the same effect. Together with high entry barriers for attackers can lead to a situation where even products with plenty of vulnerabilities are relatively infrequently or even never hacked. I mean, if you look at automotive hacking, all this stuff is out there since the 80s, Canvas and so on, and it never had been really got the attention that it had to. So it can actually also be helpful to have intransparent systems. I think Apple is perceived as probably one of the most secure products, and part of it is that a lot of people don't have access and can have understanding of the proprietary system that they have. That's a hypothesis, but I think it has some merit. And on the opposite, full transparency, which is the right way to do eventually, as we can see, Android is really, really highly secure, but it requires all products always to be patched immediately to the highest level. And any delay in that patch level will be immediately exploited by attackers because they have the same transparency, right? So it shifts eventually the responsibility to the end users. And whether that is the best choice to get the highest security level possible at this stage, I'm not really sure. And I think we need much more awareness and training for end users and also better automated patching to really reap in the benefits of full transparency, which I still believe is there. But I think there could be a situation where we have that transparency and then it only plays to the benefit of the attackers because they're smart, they're driven, they have the means and they know how to exploit it. And all the end users who don't, are not even aware why they need to patch it.
Yeah,
Nice. Anything to add?
yeah, sorry, assuming you wanted me to go next.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was this was definitely something I was very passionate about, especially before I came to Intel, and I still retain that same passion for it. And I'll caveat my comments the same way Alex did, that the things I say here are my own views and not necessarily representative of Intel. But there, modern processors today, I think, are far more complex than people think they are. When you look at a processor today, the last time I counted or received a count, the number of microcontrollers and small processing elements within a traditional Intel or AMD processor is in the thousands. So when you buy a microprocessor, you're talking about a literal network of systems within a chip. So the ability to open that up and allow someone to go in and just make arbitrary changes becomes extraordinarily complex, if it's even possible at all, because they never know what unintended consequences are going to come about. And that's really what's driven, I think, probably more than anything, keeping it closed is simply to maintain the functionality. People often think that it's a security aspect. I did before I came to Intel. That was absolutely my view on it. Since coming here, I've had my eyes open a little bit on that. So the question has become, well, what else can we do to create that transparency, to give that capability, to, as you mentioned, Rob, to allow for this transfer of ownership? And I think looking at the industry right now, you're seeing a trend with creation of smaller root of trust components. You see things like the Google Titan, Microsoft Cerberus, Amazon has their own Pluton processor element. They're creating their own because it's easier for them to do the security, because they also control the functionality. And when you control the functionality and you control the security, you can do a lot of things. Trying to partition those out is often more difficult than you might think it is. So that, I think, is probably where we're seeing the trend move in the industry, is to these small embedded security elements within each of the different components. And you'll see specifications. I'm leading one in the Trusted Computing group right now. The Open Compute project has specifications for these platform level root of trust, these AC root of trust elements. Having them there and having that identity be inside of those smaller components, inside of the larger, connected to the larger system. And then when you want to do that transfer of ownership, you're swapping out those pieces where they control this small microprocessor security element that has that identity and other information on it. That's not the only thing that's being done, but that's probably the biggest trend right now that I'm seeing.
Nice. Yeah, excellent. So the next topic is kind of a hot one. It's been mentioned a couple of times already today. The global chip shortage. I mean, it's no secret we're in the midst of a global chip shortage for a number of reasons. Droughts and other, COVID obviously has played a big part of this. The end result, of course, is that we're starting to see like lead times up to 24 months for some chips, and it's causing a lot of trouble for anyone who's designing a product. So, we've seen shortages all from anything from automakers and game consoles, especially all the high volume products are definitely affected. Some OEMs are buying the parts first and then designing the board, because they have no idea if by the time they get to ordering, if they're going to have the parts that they intended. So they're building the product around the part instead, which is kind of backwards from typical. And we're starting to see lots of predictions about things like counterfeiting and supply chain concerns. Recyclers are definitely trying to make a buck, and it's the market's ripe for that right now. So what are your thoughts on these shortages and what people could do to protect themselves from these sorts of security concerns in the supply chain? Why don't we start with Matt this time?
I guess I was going to say, I guess I can go first this time. So two items there: the shortage, and then what we can do from a counterfeit standpoint. So the shortage, obviously, one of the biggest difficulties here with the shortage is the ability to manufacture and process these chips. With the COVID, the inability of workers to go in obviously affected it. It also affected it in the explosion of the need for chips, with all the additional networking capabilities and things like that to support the video conferencing
Webcams.
and stuff. Exactly, webcams. You saw, I don't know about the rest of you, but I saw webcam prices in the $200, $300 range at the early days of the pandemic. And that's certainly a big part of it. And the critical issue there is in the manufacturing of these products. When you go to a TSMC or to a Samsung, who are two of the biggest open manufacturers on this, you have to put in orders months in advance, and you're putting in specific orders for a specific amount. And so when the COVID happened and we had this big boom, there wasn't just a way to immediately inject that in and boost up the order, because it takes time for a manufacturer to switch over processing from one processor family to another to another. It's just not something that they can do within 30 minutes type of thing. And so then when you put in your new order, well, you're going to the back of the line after everybody. I got to finish all my other orders before I can even get to you. And so it just created this natural cascade of delays in creating stuff. That was one of the key motivations when Pat Gelsinger came on at Intel in opening up what we're calling IDM 2.0. If you haven't heard about that, you can look up Pat. He's had several news conferences on that, and opening up Intel's manufacturing to be able to support that, to pick up some of the pace and help offload some of that, so that we're manufacturing more than just Intel products. We can manufacture ARM, RISC, etc., to help with this. In terms of the counterfeiting, yeah, this is just a breeding ground for that. The ability of an attacker to scrape off the top layer and relabel it as something else, the ability to decap things. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of crazy things out there in the industry. And yeah, it becomes that much more critical for folks to have a good understanding of who you're buying this from. Only buying the parts from reputable vendors, from people that you have an existing relationship with, that you know that these are legitimate quality Intel products or AMD products or ARM products, whatever it may be. Get that certificate of authenticity from them, boot up the part. Almost all processors today have a way to query information about them. So you need to verify what you get. If you ordered a certain clock speed, if you ordered a certain number of cores, you need to verify it when you get it. We can't just, a lot of the things that we took for granted before, we can't anymore. That's just the name of the game with security. That's our job every day, is the things we used to take advantage of, we can't do that anymore. So.
Axel, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with what Matt just said. I think he nailed it. You need to buy from reputable sources. There's a trust component. There are tests that you can do for supply chain security, but they're pricey. Some of them don't scale. The really good ones destroy the chip pretty much, right? If you know it was the right one, then it's not usable anymore. So it's a scale effect problem. So for certain high security products, I think there are solutions in place to do specific supply chain testing that include, like, operational security aspects, logistics aspects, and also some, tests at certain parts along the life cycle, but they're very pricey, and they're certainly not for every commercial product, but probably more for high security products. And coming back to the supply or shortages, yeah, I mean, I think semiconductor business is cyclical, and then add to that we have this severe shock from COVID-19, all the supply chain disruptions, and then there's something called a bullwhip effect. The further you're away from the market, the higher this, it gets amplified at every stage of the supply chain. So automotive cars, for example, they have tier one suppliers, they have sub-suppliers, they have a board bought from somebody, and those guys buy the chips. So at every stage of that supply chain, you amplify the effect, and particularly if you have long lead times of a demand shock. So now they build up all the factories in the US, even in Europe, they bring back chip manufacturing, which is great. I mean, I like to see that, bringing back chip manufacturing all around the world. But in a few years, probably we have a glut, too many things, and then the prices collapse. And it's all this very cyclical business. And with the severe shock of COVID and supply chain disruptions, this is really unheard of a problem. And I think what I'd like to add here is the geopolitical decoupling aspect. So we have this intensifying rivalry between the US and the West in general, and China and other countries on the other hand, and it's going to be decoupled. So it's happening already. Some call it deglobalization, but probably we have two spheres, like one that is China-centric with all the ecosystem and all the supply chains, and one that's US-centric or Western-centric with all those supply chains. And I think that doesn't help on this particular problem as well, because then you have two smaller spheres that might have supply shortages or not.
Interesting. Okay, next topic I was going to discuss was around technical debt. So all of our modern chips, contain thousands of distinct IP blocks, often sourced from external partners and IP vendors. When vulnerabilities are discovered in those components, they're often difficult to fix. If it's baked into the chip, if it's a mask ROM or whatnot, obviously it can't be patched. If it's firmware, you might be able to get a patch out, but even then, I mean, patching firmware in the field is got its own challenges. Of course, the best move then is to fix things before you launch. And so, that's just the accidental bugs. If there's intentional vulnerabilities trying to be inserted into that supply chain, I mean, we've seen this in the software space quite a number of times already, especially increasing in the recent years. It's probably only a matter of time before we start seeing that on the hardware side. So the question here is, what should silicon vendors be doing to address that technical debt of inherited vulnerabilities in their vendor IP, but also how could they defend against the intentional ones from supply chain attacks? It's, I don't know, Axel, we'll start with you, or Matt, I don't care.
I would suppose that Matt goes first. You're a chip manufacturer, so
sure.
I'm a terrible marketer.
No problem. So yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that's hot on the presses these days. Anyone who's been paying attention and has seen the issues with the software supply chain that have been going on, if you've seen that, then you've got to, it hopefully is leading you to the question of, well, what about the hardware? A lot of the same type of attacks that were leveraged against the software, there's really no reason that they can't be leveraged against the hardware as well, in terms of the design process and the build and everything else. It's a very similar from the the code design portion up until you actually start manufacturing. So yeah, how are we looking at that? And there's a lot of government work going on in this area to figure out how we can address that. How can we put together bombs? We hear about software bombs in the supply chain. What about hardware bombs? Can I get information on everything that went into this product? What are the constraints and requirements from a security perspective that the larger manufacturers put on the smaller vendors that when we pull in their IP or we take in their device or whatever and we incorporate it into our own, what are the security requirements that they're doing for their product? How do those line up with what we're doing on our products? And who's responsible for filling the gap? Who's responsible for identifying the gaps and then of course filling the gaps? And it can be very challenging on the smaller vendors because, as was mentioned here before, security tools often aren't cheap. Doing this type of analysis, not only is it expensive from the licensing standpoint of the tools, but also the time, the commitment, the overhead. Security just plain and simply isn't cheap. If it was cheap, security would be everywhere. We all know that, but it's not. So they have difficulty, and the larger manufacturers, it falls on them to help a little bit, to work together in the industry, to lift one another up. When we're lifting the security of a smaller vendor that we're using in our product, and ultimately we're lifting our own security. So working together with the vendors, coming up with comprehensive plans, and of course working on standards where we have that information and we can design things to certain standards, have certain security protocols and stuff like that that we're taking to make sure that the designs are the integrity is as strong as we can make it, that it gets successfully from one place to another, and when it gets put into an Intel chip, an AMD chip, an ARM chip, whatever, that it is exactly what that designer manufactured. Because as you mentioned, what about these hardware bugs? What about someone inserting something in there, a malicious insider or something like that? The government's moving to a zero trust architecture. Maybe that's easy to do in the public sector world, where everyone just kind of builds on security, but going in the private sector, how do you go to your employees and you say, I don't trust you, so you're going to give me everything and then I'm going to re-verify it because I don't trust you, and I'm not going to trust you until I'm done verifying it? That just doesn't work well with morale. So how do we in the private sector put together a zero trust type of architecture to be able to support what public sectors and other organizations are doing? That becomes, I think, for me, one of the next big challenges of how we integrate those two things together, and how do we build that up? Because if we don't, then you're absolutely right. We're opening ourselves up to injection in products. We're opening ourselves up to malicious alteration and things like that. And that becomes very scary because it's very difficult to fix those type of things in the field.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Matt said. Zero trust. I think I like what Ronald Reagan said: trust but verify. I think that's what you need to do. But exactly as Matthew pointed out, this has a big issue on morale and others, and also economic impact that is not feasible for most of the products. I would say it could work for high security government solution products, but I think to really prevent against these nation state actors, that's really, really pricey. I don't know if that's really the biggest challenge, or whether it's already good to secure against criminals and script kiddies and so on, which we already struggle to do. But yeah, and coming back to what the vendor should do, I think most of the vulnerabilities, even the really nasty in hardware, can be mitigated by one way or another with software. And usually it comes at a heavy performance and usability cost. But in the end, you can mitigate pretty much everything if you're willing to give up 30% performance and, I don't know, a lot of software memory space. But I think what the vendors really need to do is they need to invest much more effort and manpower in handling patches and developing proper patches. And they should at least write easy to understand white papers that explain both the vulnerability and how the mitigation works so that others understand the limitations of the mitigations. I think they should provide well-engineered performance optimized patches, not something that is quickly out the door, but something that is really a good piece of software for the next layer of stack. And they should work with those people on the next layer of stack so that they can easily integrate it in the next software update then as well. And ideally, the patches could have different optimization goals: low power, low energy, low code size, low latency, high throughput, whatever, so that, potentially with a compile switch, you might be able to integrate it then further up. And I think that the benefit then is because then it becomes really, really expensive to do a proper job in patching the mess that you have created pretty much. Then it probably becomes easier to justify upfront security costs in-house to do your homework, to do a better job in designing the product. But it will never be the case that, security by design is an oxymoron. It's not possible because new attacks come up, new techniques, and it never be possible. So you always have a situation, but it still helps, I think, to have these costs, because then you can have more cost justified to build a secure product in the beginning.
Okay. The last question I had is really open-ended. We've seen a lot of micro-architectural attacks, Spectre meltdown, and subsequently, dozens more like that. Anytime there's a shared resource on the chip, there tends to be a side channel there. It doesn't seem to be much way around that other than just not running third-party code, which just frankly doesn't work in a browser-based world. So I guess where do you think this is all going next? Where do you think the next big areas for security research are going to be on both the offensive and defensive side? We'll start with Axel here.
I think for the defensive side, it's probably integrating existing solutions properly from hardware and firmware or kernel handling all the way to containers and so on to make secure products. I don't know if you know hardened walls, these kind of things I really like. And I think also leveraging attack tools or methods for defense purposes is a nice thing. You can use side channels for IP watermarking, for example, these kind of things. And I think automated patch management is really, really important and needs some research. On the offensive sides, might be my passion, but I think UEFI and Ring-3 and so on, all down there, I think this is really, really interesting breeding ground to work and fix vulnerabilities. And in general, I think reverse engineering any proprietary hardware security features, such as fuse layouts or bitstream encodings for FPGAs, that's something too much of the trust relies upon. And I don't want to see somebody at some point having the FPGA bitstream encoding suddenly reverse engineered, and then you can, break the weak encryption and suddenly have all the designs, and then a lot of the trust model collapses. And similar with fuse layouts, this is, for me, too much responsibility with too little transparency, pretty much. I think reverse engineering any proprietary hardware security feature is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. As Axel said, he was talking about going down the UEFI level. We've seen attackers go from the application to the OS level to the hypervisor level to the UEFI level. What's next? Well, the hardware. The hardware is the next thing in line on that. And I do think that that's where the next primary focus of research and security issues are going to be. We talked earlier about hardware Trojans. We talked about hardware insertion of malicious things into hardware. I think that, from my perspective, that's the thing I'm the most worried about right now, just in general. We know that attackers are going lower and lower. That just seems like the natural place. We've seen the software supply chain issues that have come about over the last couple of months. We only expect that to get bigger, and we've got to assume that's going to move into the hardware side as well. So what are we doing as an industry on the hardware side to look into that and find potential issues, which is why you asked the question, Rob. And then from the defensive side of the house, for me, I still think it's going to be modularization of security capabilities. It's going to be security as a service technologies. We're looking at the platform root of trust. We're looking at pulling trust into isolated execution environments. One of the biggest issues right now, when an attacker attacks a system and they gain execution on the operating system, they're attacking the same system that has the security, that's implementing the security. We just can't do that. You've got to be able to isolate the security away from the normal execution environment, so that when an attacker gains execution in your standard operating system, he or she does not have the ability to then manipulate the security of the system. The security needs to be pristine. It needs to be running. It needs to always be checking for those things. And if it's running in the same environment that the hacker could potentially get into, that's a problem. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of security being pulled out of the OS, pulled into these smaller platform root of trust elements, AC root of trust elements, things like that, executing out of band, but with introspection into the traditional running operating system. And I think as you see that, you also see an expansion of security as a service capabilities. You're going to see all kind of new frameworks and things like that for running security on systems with separated security elements that are doing that introspection and continually monitoring the security of the system, but doing so from a separate execution environment. I really think that, from my perspective, is where on the defensive side, we really need to be looking, and I think we really are looking and starting to right now to build that up and make that happen.
Nice, very good. So at this point, I guess there's a couple of questions in the chat. Let's ask those here. First one here is, I missed the part where Matt was talking about thousands of processors in a computer. Could you elaborate on that? I think maybe it was the scale of the number of microcontrollers that probably caught them off guard.
Yeah, so this actually caught me off guard. But my boss, when I first came, after being at Intel for the first couple of months, he gave me a presentation, and one of his slides in the presentation, it was talking about the number of microcontrollers and small computing elements inside of a single processor. And that is now, what used to be, 1, 5, 10, 20 is now turning into thousands. So all the different functionalities and capabilities and things like that you might look at, all the different interconnects, the bus level translators and things like that, a lot of those things now run on small microcontrollers on there that actually have their own code base and stuff like that are running. So as a result, what looks like, for instance, an 8-core Intel processor is actually an entire network of microcontrollers and processing elements all within a single chip, with those 8 cores just being the biggest processing thing on there. So it was fascinating to me. I think it probably fascinating to most people as well.
Yeah. The next question was, should the U.S. reduce dependency of chip manufacturing and focus more on inland manufacturing? And I think we covered this a little bit as well. Right? Axel, you were commenting about how there's a decoupling going on. Did you want to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. I mean, I think chips are strategic, right? So, and the US still has a large chip manufacturer with Intel having lots of fabs still in the US, plenty of fabs. And I think there's another $40+ billion being spent now on additional chip manufacturing capabilities in the US. So yeah, I mean, they have it. I'm from Germany, and we used to have chip manufacturing capabilities. AMD was there, and Siemens. I think they're also talking about bringing something back to Germany. It certainly reduces dependability on other states. So from a strategic perspective, I think it is important to do that. It's just a question of the economics, if they can get it to work. Well, that makes sense. And whenever the government has to subsidize something, it skews the market. And then, it's a bit like coal, right? Coal mining was subsidized everywhere for a long time because it was a strategic resource. And now chips are the same, right? So how long should we subsidize it, or where should be the balance being taken? And this is clearly a political decision. So I can't really comment on that. So.
Cool. How are manufacturers handling the feature size limitations, especially now that we're reaching the atomic level sizes? Who wants to take a stab at this one?
I was gonna say, I think that would probably be directed to me, and unfortunately, I'm the wrong person to answer it on behalf of Intel. I'm not the hardware designer. I'm the security person. But I do know, yeah, we are getting down. We're getting down to Intel processing. We're 10 nanometer in our latest chip, 7 nanometer we're working on as well. Trying to get down at TSMC, I think last was reported at 5 nanometer or 3 nanometer even. How much lower can we go? It's a good question. And the physics behind that, how the move to FinFET and changing the way the transistors work obviously is helping us there to go smaller and smaller, but how much smaller can we go? And we just don't know. And so, yeah, from that perspective, I think it then becomes an issue of what about stacking? What about 3D layering on the processors and things like that? Intel, for instance, has the Foveros technology that we use on a few of our processors to be able to stack things into a full system on a chip technology. And I think that's probably, I'm just guessing here again, this is just my opinion, probably the next avenue that we're going to go down on that. Obviously, you're still trying to shrink the transistors down as small as you can, but to whatever limit you get to, you got to start looking at other options. So 3D stacking.
I know at least some companies are even going wider. There's a number of companies looking at wafer scale where they're putting 800,000 cores on the same 18-inch platter or whatever. So it's just pushing physics in all the different directions.
Yep.
The next question here was about right to repair. How do you support right to repair? I guess this relates to our first topic. We talked about open hardware a little bit. I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at that one.
So I mean, I'm certainly a fan of it. Now there's security implications to that, and that becomes a big question: is how do you handle the security questions? There's also legal ramifications, whether we like it or not. We live in a world where there's legal ramifications, and if you just open it up, well, who's liable at that point in time? And I think for better or for worse, that ends up being a driving factor more than anything else. The security we can work around. I think we are. We're as an industry, we're looking at the way to do this. How can we take what used to be hard coded into fuses or something like that in the processors? How can we put it into something that's rewritable so that you can transfer ownership, you can unlock the part, things like that you can do this right to repair on that? Because one of the analogies I use with security is designing security is like packing a bag for someone when you don't know where they're going, what they're doing, or how long they'll be there. You as the end customer, where you're putting your product, what you're using it for, and how long you expect it to be there. So why aren't you doing the security on the product? Why are we doing it for you, type of thing? So that does become a question. The best way to address that is to have a right to repair type of mentality, an open source security solution, things like that, where you're giving individuals the ability to customize the security for them. So that's certainly something that's being researched and looked into. And we'll just have to be patient, unfortunately, and see what happens with it.
And the last comment I'm seeing here is following up on the right to repair arguments. Do you think that there's a way to encourage vendors to unlock end-of-life devices that will no longer receive updates, unlocking bootloaders, releasing keys, etc.? Would you be would it be nice to see an optional update for end users that want to repurpose the hardware and prevent them from ending up in a landfill? Axel, you wanna take that one?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm fully aligned with what Matthew said. I also like right to repair, open source. I'm fully on board with that. But similarly, I see legal challenges, liability issues, and economic impact. If suddenly you open up something and severe vulnerability is found, then inside the company, somebody will be punished for that, I guess. So and then it needs to be fixed, and sometimes it has impact on stock prices and so on and so forth. So people will always try to cover their backs before they do that. So I think it's nice to. I like the idea that was posted in the chat here that once the products are end of life and pretty much there's no more money to be made by it, if then it's like given to the greater good, because usually these products are still valid for other use cases then.
Yeah, and someone posted an example here, the microchip battery monitor chips for automotive support, second life, so that they can be used for used auto EV battery, can be repurposed as a whole home battery. It's interesting. So it might not be appropriate for vehicles anymore, but you could use it in a more stationary application. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to ask?
Rob, there's one question more. I think that's the last one. That's about the microchip battery monitor.
That was one I just read. I don't think it was a question.
Okay.
It was more of a comment.
Comment. Okay, great. I think that's it for now. Yeah, I think we'll skip this question because we're running out of time. So thank you, Rob, Axel, Matt. This was amazing. I'm not sure if you guys saw, but we also had your entire panel drawn as well. So
Saw that.
I will send it. Yeah, I send it to you guys after the conference. It's going to be amazing. It looks pretty as well. So friends from the audience also, I hope you guys like it. If you would like to reach out to this artist, let us know. We're happy to connect you.
Yeah, Andrzej,
Aston. Yes.
Can you please put a bag on it? Because I really like Matthew's analogy to packing a bag for somebody else going on vacation, not knowing when and how, because this is really, this sticks here. I really like to see a bag on that to remind me.
You mean a
quote.
backpack?
Yeah, backpack.
Like a suitcase.
No, okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right. Aston, when you draw the backpack, write hardwear.io over there. Yeah. All right.
I've never had anyone live drawing a talk before. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we did this. We did this for both the keynotes and for the closing panel from you guys. So I hope you guys liked it, and I'll share with you guys a printed copy as well once I have your postal address.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Cool. Thank you so much.